Tonight, we step into a world where diplomacy didn't begin with a handshake over wine glasses or even a summit in Geneva, but instead with a humble paddle, a plastic ball, and a sleepy gymnasium in Nagoya, Japan. You're standing there now in April of 1971, rubbing your eyes, unsure if it's the jet lag or the surreal setting. The Cold War's been dragging on like a bad family feud, icy bitter and stretched across continents. The United States and the People's Republic of China haven't spoken in over 2 decades, and yet here you are in a humid sports hall watching a US table tennis player blink in confusion as a Chinese athlete approaches with an unexpected smile. The clack of the ping-pong ball echoes through the bleachers. The gym smells faintly of linoleum, old socks, and someone's forgotten instant noodles. Around you, athletes from across the world loiter, stretching lazily or dozing off. The 31st World Table Tennis Championships are drawing to a close. You've probably yawned your way through too many matches already, but what's about to happen in the next 5 minutes, that'll make history textbooks, or at least very niche bedtime podcasts. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop your location and what time it is where you're watching. Always love seeing where you're listening in from. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You watch Glenn Cowan, a young, shaggy-haired American ping-pong player, get onto a shuttle bus late as usual. The rest of his teammates had already left. He awkwardly boards the Chinese team's bus, a situation that feels almost taboo. Remember, this is 1971. Americans and Chinese were not supposed to be casually sharing bus rides, not without sparking international suspicion or at least some very intense telegrams. But this is where fate decides to paddle in. Sitting near the front is Zhuang Zedong, a 3-time world champion and one of China's most recognizable athletes. Zhuang is calm, elegant, and dressed in that signature drab olive-green uniform the Chinese delegation wears like a badge of ideological purity. He spots the young American disheveled, clearly a little lost, and does something unheard of at the time. He walks over, he smiles, and he offers Cowan a silkscreen portrait of Huangshan, the Yellow Mountains. Just like that. Historians still argue whether Zhuang acted entirely on impulse or whether he had subtle approval from the Chinese authorities. Some say he saw a photo op, others say it was pure kindness. Either way, you're there watching as Cowan clearly flustered smiles and accepts the gift. They pose for photos. The Chinese photographers, typically tight-lipped and state-directed, don't stop them. In fact, one of them subtly frames the handshake just right. That image, it'll be front-page news across the globe within 48 hours. And you tired, confused, and now suddenly a wide-eyed witness can't help but think, was that allowed? It wasn't just allowed, it was historic. This seemingly simple gesture played out on a bus of all places sets into motion one of the most unexpected diplomatic reboots of the 20th century. The press soon latches onto the story with a hunger usually reserved for Hollywood scandals or moon landings. One headline reads, "Little ball bounces across big divide." It's cheesy, it's glorious, and it's surprisingly accurate. The quirky part, Glenn Cowan, it turns out, was a bit of a hippie, headbands, tie-dye shirts, peace signs. Not exactly what Chinese officials were expecting from a visiting American athlete. One of them apparently whispered, "Is this what all Americans look like now?" And honestly, you'd be asking the same thing. But whether or not anyone grasped the full implications yet, one thing was certain: the ice had cracked. Slightly. Diplomacy had found its tiniest opening right between 2 rubber paddles. And now, somewhere deep inside the walled compounds of Beijing, powerful people are taking note, carefully, cautiously, and soon things will begin to move. You barely have time to process what just happened on that shuttle bus before the political cogs begin grinding into motion thousands of miles away. Back in China, where you can almost feel the weight of watchful silence pressing down on every street corner, the news of Zhuang Zedong's gesture spreads faster than smuggled Beatles records in Beijing dorm rooms. And surprisingly, rather than a crackdown or a scolding, the response from the top is Interest. Zhuang is summoned, of course. You don't just fraternize with Americans without a little debriefing. He's brought before Chinese officials and questioned, though not with the severity you'd expect. It's more like they're poking a soft spot on an old bruise, curious, a little cautious, maybe even hopeful. Mao Zedong himself is informed. And here's where things get interesting instead of punishment. Zhuang receives a quiet nod of approval. The man had handed a peace offering to an American, and it had worked. Just a picture, just a smile, but the headlines were already calling it a diplomatic miracle. The People's Daily, the official voice of the Communist Party, publishes a short, vague note about the ping-pong interaction. That's their version of shouting from the rooftops. And soon after an unprecedented invitation is sent, the US table tennis team is formally invited to visit the People's Republic of China. You read that again, and yes, it still says formally invited to China by China in 1971. This is seismic. For over 2 decades, the two countries have lived in a deep freeze. The US didn't even officially recognize the PRC as a country. There were no embassies, no direct flights, not even mutual phone lines. And now, thanks to a ping-pong paddle and an oddly photogenic American hippie, China is opening its gates. Historians still argue whether Mao had planned this kind of opening for years, or whether he simply saw an opportunity in the Cowen-Zhuang handshake and ran with it. Some suggest the Cultural Revolution had exhausted the country's energy and Mao needed a fresh narrative. Others believe the Soviet threat looming over both nations pushed them into this odd bedfellow scenario. Either way, the moment is real and it's catching momentum. Meanwhile, Glenn Cowen becomes something of a mini-celebrity. He does interviews back in the States, fumbling charmingly through questions about diplomacy while still wearing tie-dye. One night he tells a late-night host, "I guess I was just in the right place at the right time." You can't help but nod or yawn, maybe both. Back in China, Zhuang Zedong doesn't just fade into the background, he becomes a symbol. Carefully managed, of course. Every quote is vetted, every appearance choreographed. But there's a slight shift now, a glimpse of openness, however brief. You can feel it in the way Chinese newspapers cautiously reference the Americans, not as imperialist dogs, not anymore, just Americans, visitors, athletes. And here's the quirky bit that almost no one talks about. Zhuang's gesture wasn't entirely spontaneous. In later years, he hinted that while he did act on instinct, he also had a sense that the political winds were shifting, that someone somewhere in the upper echelons was waiting for the right moment to test a new path. It just so happened that path came in the form of a shuttle bus and a smiling American. You, of course, are still rubbing sleep from your eyes, wondering if anyone realizes the sheer absurdity of it all. Two governments that can't stand each other, caught in ideological deadlock, are now talking because of ping-pong. It's almost too ridiculous to be true. And yet, here we are. Meanwhile, the other US team members, far less hippie-ish than Cowen, are just trying to make sense of it. They hold quiet meetings with State Department officials, wondering what to expect. Will there be translators? Will there be cameras? Will they be followed around by men in grey coats jotting notes on their lunch orders? Spoiler alert, yes, but not quite in the way you'd expect. For now, the American public is waking up to headlines that are a mix of confusion, excitement, and Cold War suspicion. Walter Cronkite himself calls it a surprise opening in one of the world's most frozen relationships. Parents across the country are now being asked by their curious kids what exactly ping-pong has to do with communism. And as the world starts shifting ever so slightly, you dreamy-eyed lying in bed or curling on the couch are probably thinking diplomacy's weird, and sometimes it works. Now imagine you're a fly on the faded wall of an office somewhere in the Zhongnanhai compound, the Chinese Communist Party's heavily guarded heart in Beijing. Everything smells faintly of tea leaves and dusty carpets. The air is still thick with the weight of decisions yet to be made. An invitation has been extended, but what comes next? This is the part where the cautious silence after a bold move starts to feel louder than the move itself. You drift through the corridors of Chinese diplomacy in April 1971, past functionaries with clipboards and carefully starched collars, past phones that almost never ring internationally. The political atmosphere remains tightly controlled as always, but something's changed. The bus moment has gone from anecdote to agenda item. The photo of Zhuang and Cowan smiling awkwardly on the shuttle bus has now appeared in both American and Chinese media. Not loudly, not splashily, but it's out there hanging in the air like a test balloon floating just above the bamboo curtain. The US team, still in Japan after the championships, is stunned by the invitation. You're practically looking over their shoulders as they stare at the facts, yes, actual facts sent from Beijing. We are pleased to invite the American table tennis team to visit our country. No one quite knows how to respond. One player asks, "Do we need shots for that?" Another says, "I didn't even bring a passport." It's that sudden. Historians still argue whether China's leaders were testing the waters for a broader geopolitical shift, or whether this was just meant to be a brief symbolic gesture to stir global attention. Either way, the US government sees a glimmer of opportunity in the unlikely ping-pong invitation. Nixon, ever the pragmatist, gives a small, sly nod. Secretary of State William Rogers doesn't object. And somewhere behind a locked door, Henry Kissinger starts scheming. But let's not skip ahead. You're still in the part of the story where everything feels like a very slow, very confusing dream. The American table tennis team, 8 players, a couple of officials and one woman, pack their bags in a daze. Some of them have never even left the US before. Now they're headed for China, a country most Americans had only ever seen in black and white newsreels featuring parades of missiles and frowning soldiers. As the players prepare to board their flight from Tokyo to Hong Kong, where they'll transfer into mainland China, the mood is a surreal cocktail of excitement, fear, and jet lag. Journalists swarm them at the airport. "Do you know what you're walking into?" one reporter asks. "We're just going to play some ping pong," one player shrugs. If only it were that simple. Meanwhile, on the Chinese side, preparations are no less frantic. Hotels are being swept. Itineraries are revised hourly. Food menus are translated with great suspicion. Interpreters are briefed down to the syllable. Even the table tennis venues are inspected not just for security but for aesthetics. No one wants to accidentally offend the Americans with the wrong color of tablecloth. You couldn't make this stuff up. And now you land in China, not as a diplomat, not as a spy, but as a sleepy ping-pong player caught in the machinery of international intrigue. As you step off the plane, you're greeted by a polite but stoic reception committee. There are red banners welcoming American friends. The awkwardness is real and palpable. One of the players mutters, "This is weird." Another nods, "Yeah, but good weird." Your hotel room is clean, modest, and bugged probably. Every conversation, every smile, every nod will be analyzed, cross-referenced, and filed. You're not just guests, you're live-action test subjects in a geopolitical science experiment. But you don't feel like that yet. You just feel tired. Here's the quirky part. China was undergoing major internal turmoil at the time. The Cultural Revolution was still technically in full swing. Red Guard slogans still screamed from brick walls. Yet the arrival of the American team was treated with a sort of reverent curiosity. Locals lined the streets to sneak glimpses of the Lau Mei visitors. Some kids waved, some old folks just stared. For many, you were the first Americans they'd ever seen in person. You wore different shoes, your hair was strange, and your presence defied decades of propaganda. In those first moments, diplomacy didn't look like a handshake. It looked like 2 sweaty guys at a ping-pong table trying to outspin each other while a crowd of quiet, blinking Chinese students watched in fascination. The games were friendly, the scores didn't matter, but the symbolism was enormous. A little plastic ball bouncing gently over a net had become a bridge. And back home, the news cycle went wild. Every photograph, every quote, every video clip was picked apart. Were the Americans being brainwashed? Was China trying to soften its image before something big? Was Nixon actually going to visit? Nobody knew. But everyone was suddenly paying attention, and you, somewhere between amused and overwhelmed, begin to realize that you're not just witnessing détente. You're paddling right through it. You're sitting cross-legged in a hotel chair with upholstery that smells faintly of stale tea and state secrets, watching the headlines spin themselves into history. One article calls it the backhand that changed the world. Another insists it's all smoke and mirrors, a communist trick. But deep inside Zhongnanhai, China's inner sanctum of leadership, a different kind of conversation is unfolding, quiet, strategic, and surprisingly hopeful. Word reaches Mao Zedong that the American table tennis team has arrived and is being received positively, not only by party officials, but by ordinary people. This is no small feat in a country where smiling at foreigners was once considered politically risky. And Mao, who's been ailing but still very much the sun around which everything orbits, decides he wants to play the next move himself. You can almost hear the hush that falls when he utters his next order: invite more Americans. Specifically, he says let them come in groups of journalists, scientists, scholars, not just athletes. This is not a man known for subtlety. But here he is orchestrating soft power like he's conducting a diplomatic orchestra from a bamboo podium. Historians still argue whether Mao's motives were rooted in genuine reconciliation or sheer realpolitik. Was he trying to counterbalance the rising Soviet threat? Was he preparing the country for eventual modernization? Or was it just a flex to show he could, with a single decree, redraw international lines? Whatever the motive, the decision is made. The door is creaking open wider. You meanwhile are still reeling from your visit to the Great Wall. The American team has been trotted around like honored guests, the Forbidden City, the Summer Palace, even a performance of the revolutionary ballet, the Red Detachment of Women. You sit politely in your stiff seat, watching performers leap with alarming precision under banners of Marxist slogans. A teammate whispers, "So!" This is like Cats, but if it were written by Lenin, you both snort quietly. At every stop you're accompanied by smiling guides and well-dressed minders. They ask what you think of China. They beam when you say very interesting, and they nod solemnly when you say very different. You can feel that the right words matter here, perhaps more than the honest ones. Then in the quiet of evening, the message arrives, a rare, hand-delivered telegram. It's brief, polite, and surreal. Chairman Mao would like to meet with the American table tennis delegation. Just reading that your heart skips a beat. You're not diplomats, you're athletes, college kids, people who got C-minuses in political science, and now you're invited to meet Mao Zedong. The atmosphere turns electric. Preparations begin instantly. You're told how to enter the room, how to bow slightly, how to address him, how not to say anything regrettable. You rehearse nervously in your hotel bathroom mirror. "Hello, Mr. Chairman. It's an honor." You try smiling, then not smiling. Too smiley and you look like a tourist. Too serious and you look like a spy. You finally give up and go with awkward. The meeting happens in the same compound where so many secrets of state have been whispered over tiny cups of tea. Mao, now frail but unmistakably commanding, sits in a padded chair with a blanket over his legs. His eyes are sharp, his presence dense. He doesn't speak much, his voice is raspy, his lungs tired. But when he does, it lands with the thud of historical weight. "You have opened a door," he says. "We welcome you." Quirky tidbit Mao offers the team Chinese tea and watermelon seeds. One player spills both down his front. Mao chuckles. Just a little. That in itself becomes a legend. Cameras flash. Journalists in China and abroad write breathless accounts. American newspapers call it the most significant thaw in Sino-American relations since the communist takeover in 1949. Chinese outlets don't gush, but the silence is notably less silent. And in that single, improbable audience between a revolutionary chairman and a gaggle of confused American paddlers, decades of hostility don't dissolve, but they soften like frost-catching morning light. When you leave the meeting, the sky above Beijing is unusually clear. You breathe in the cold air, then exhale, letting your shoulders drop for the first time in days. You were just part of history. And no, you didn't even win your match against the Chinese champion, but you're starting to realize that was never the point. Back in Washington, Nixon smiles when he reads the report. The man who once built his career on being staunchly anti-communist now sees his opening. A sliver of political possibility served on a paddle, and across China, quiet curiosity blooms. Somewhere, a school child asks her teacher, "What's ping pong like in America?" And that question so small carries with it the weight of millions more to come. You're reclining now in a well-worn armchair inside the West Wing, where the carpet smells of decades of power and polished leather. Across the room, Richard Nixon is looking at a black and white photograph of Mao Zedong shaking hands with an American ping-pong player. The president's brows are furrowed, but his lips curl upward ever so slightly, something between a grin and a poker face. The timing is just too perfect, too strange. Nixon had been quietly toying with the idea of reaching out to China, but now, thanks to a scrappy band of table tennis players, the world's most notoriously sealed regime has made the first public move. So what does he do? He smiles again. Only this time it's all chessboard. One move deserves another. In the weeks following the team's visit to China, the US State Department begins working behind the scenes to draft what they refer to as the Ping Pong Memo. It's a dry name for what is essentially a green light to proceed. Diplomatic backchannels are lit up. Nixon, always a strategist, sees this bizarre little sport as a Trojan horse. No one expects foreign policy to ride in on a sport invented by bored British aristocrats. And yet here we are. Historians still argue whether Nixon was genuinely interested in rapprochement with China or whether he simply saw it as a way to scare the Soviets. A classic, let's keep Moscow on its toes maneuver. Either way, you've got two major superpowers, one capitalist, one communist, both now peeking at each other through the little crack made by a celluloid ball. And if that wasn't strange enough, the US team returns to the States as unlikely celebrities. You catch one of them sweating in his blue and white tracksuit trying to explain on national TV what it was like dining with communist officials. Well, there were a lot of dumplings, and it was actually kind of nice. The host raises an eyebrow. Cue the laugh track. But beneath the jokes and news snippets, something deeper is shifting. The American public, used to hearing about Red China only in Cold War doomsday tones, is now seeing images of smiling Chinese hosts, tea ceremonies, and yes, good-natured ping-pong matches. It doesn't undo 20 years of hostility, but it does something even more powerful in the long run. It humanizes. You scroll through the letters to the editor in the New York Times. One reads, "I never thought I'd live to see Americans play ping-pong in Beijing." Another says, "Is this the beginning of something real? Nobody knows yet, but everyone's watching." And back in China, the mood is complicated. While government censors still keep a tight lid on the narrative, there's no denying that something big has shifted. The team's tour was carefully choreographed, but the ripple effect can't be so easily managed. In university dorms and smoky backrooms, young Chinese begin to whisper about what it all means. They ask questions. Are Americans really so different? What happens if we talk more? Is our future still only revolution? The quirky bit. Some local sports clubs start adding more ping-pong tables. As silly as it sounds, kids want to be the next Zhuang Zedong. Not just a champion, but a messenger. A soft diplomat in short sleeves. Meanwhile, the White House starts drawing up a bold idea. What if Nixon himself were to go to China? It's audacious, unheard of. No sitting US president has ever set foot in communist China. Nixon, of all people, the anti-communist crusader of the 1950s, visiting Mao Zedong. It's like Darth Vader crashing the Ewok village and being invited to dinner. But Nixon, as always, thinks in moves and counter-moves. If he goes to China, he upends the chessboard, he tilts the Cold War, he makes history. So with quiet approval from his inner circle, a secret mission is planned. But no one must know yet. Not Congress, not the press, not even most of his cabinet. It's all whispered through diplomatic channels and disguised itineraries. No trail, no headlines yet. And while Kissinger readies his passport, the press keeps talking about ping pong. The photos from the Chinese tour are now part of magazines and even a few school textbooks. Your niece comes home and says, "Did you know ping pong saved the world?" You chuckle, but deep down it doesn't feel entirely untrue. In Washington, Nixon walks into a press briefing with a glint in his eye and drops a single line that makes every reporter sit up. The door to China has been opened a crack. Now let's see how far it swings. And that's when you realize this wasn't about ping pong anymore. That was just the warm-up. The real game is about to begin. You wake up, if that's even possible, in a dream this strange, and find yourself sitting in a US State Department conference room in late 1971, surrounded by maps, teacups, and more silence than any government building should legally allow. Across from you, aides whisper over papers marked confidential, red underlines screaming urgency. Someone taps a yellow legal pad. Another scribbles PRC visit logistics security optics. You sip lukewarm coffee and realize the word optics is being used more than diplomacy. You're preparing for a visit that just months ago was unthinkable, a formal American delegation entering the People's Republic of China for the first time since 1949. Not just ping pong players now, but politicians, planners, and eventually the president himself, all because of a game, or rather what the game unlocked. But first, someone's got to test the waters. Cue the American ping pong team's second trip to China, this time in full knowledge of its symbolic heft. You're now part of the soft power campaign. You're not just paddling, you're performing diplomacy. With every handshake, every photo, every slightly overcooked dumpling, you politely chew with a smile. As you step off the plane at Beijing Airport again, the greeting feels warmer. Still formal, yes, still a bit rehearsed. But the eyes of your hosts don't flicker with quite so much suspicion. One man, an interpreter, even tells you a joke about table tennis. You don't laugh right away because you weren't expecting it, but then you do, and it's real. Historians still argue whether this second ping pong visit was mainly window dressing or if it genuinely helped solidify trust between the two countries. It probably did both. On the surface, it was all photo ops, but underneath, real exchange. Real listening. The Chinese asked questions this time about life in America, about universities, about jazz music, oddly. One even asked, "Do Americans eat rice and you spoon halfway to your mouth?" Answered, "Sometimes, but we also do pizza." That got a few raised eyebrows. The Chinese team hosts a series of friendship matches, each one carefully set in symbolic locations. You find yourself playing in an old workers' gym with a faded portrait of Chairman Mao gazing sternly above the net. Another day, it's a newer sports complex, one that looks a little too polished to have existed before you got here. Everything has a deeper meaning, and even the air conditioning hums with political intent. Quirky? Detail. One match is interrupted by a power outage. For 10 minutes, everyone just sits there, laughing awkwardly in the dark, pretending this isn't a historic moment held together by candlelight and diplomatic duct tape. Someone breaks the silence by bouncing a ping-pong ball off the table blindly. It hits a Communist Party official in the shoulder. No one dies. In fact, the man chuckles. Progress. You begin to notice how much has changed since your first visit. Back then, every phrase was stiff. Every itinerary was guarded like a state secret. Now you're invited to speak at a university. You get to sit with students, some of whom speak halting English, others who ask you about rock music. A girl shows you a notebook where she's written the lyrics to Let It Be. You blink. She shrugs. My cousin smuggled Beatles tape from Hong Kong. There's another moment that sticks with you, a banquet in a hall lined with red banners. You're served dishes you can't quite identify, one of which may be jellyfish. A local party official raises a toast and says, "This is not just friendship match. This is handshake between two people." The room clinks glasses. You try not to spill yours again. And all the while, back in Washington, the machinery is shifting faster. Kissinger has already visited China in secret, yes, secretly, and laid the groundwork for a possible Nixon visit. His trip is deliberately unpublicized. Officially, he's in Pakistan. Unofficially, he's eating duck tongue in Beijing and shaking hands with Zhou Enlai. Zhou, the soft-spoken, sharp-eyed premier of China, is Mao's right-hand man and arguably the most polished statesman in the communist world. Kissinger finds him unexpectedly urbane, almost European, he later remarks. You imagine the meeting, heavy curtains, porcelain teacups, and two men from worlds apart navigating centuries of mistrust over jasmine steam. And what's driving it all forward, greasing the gears of this bizarre diplomatic dance, is the memory of a plastic ball and two paddles still echoing through every gesture. By the time you and your teammates leave Beijing this second time, the difference is palpable. The farewell is warmer, the bows deeper, and the tension looser. As the plane lifts off the tarmac, you peek out the window and wonder if that really just happened again. You came to play a game, but ended up laying bricks for a political bridge. In the cabin, someone opens a newspaper and points to a headline, "Nixon may visit China." Another player whispers, "Man, we really started something." And yeah, you did. By now, you've stopped questioning how a paddle and a plastic ball could upend decades of Cold War silence. You've accepted that the universe works in strange ways. Still, as the whispers about a Nixon visit grow louder, you can't help but marvel at how something so casual, so inherently goofy, let's be honest, watching two grown men slam a ping-pong ball back and forth will never not be a little silly, has become the gravitational center of global diplomacy. It's late 1971 and you're now stepping into Beijing not as a tourist or a guest, but as a witness to something unfolding that few ever imagined. When you visit the US liaison office, freshly installed in a borrowed space, operating under what amounts to diplomatic training wheels, it's as if you've wandered onto the movie set of a political rom-com, awkward glances, lots of indirect phrases, and that one scene where both sides reach for the same soy sauce. And yet beneath the awkwardness, real work is happening. The Chinese are cautiously receptive, the Americans are cautiously thrilled. For the first time in decades, meaningful conversations are being had without threats, sanctions, or long-winded ideological lectures. Just two countries trying to understand each other's table manners. It's around this time you're invited to attend a match in the old Beijing Workers' Stadium. The seats are filled not only with ordinary citizens but with journalists and party officials. The vibe is festive but formal, like a wedding where everyone's still waiting to see if the bride and groom are serious. The match begins and the crowd erupts into polite applause. You can feel that this isn't about winning, it's about showing up, about being seen. And then something small but remarkable happens. A Chinese player loses a point and laughs, just a light chuckle, nothing outrageous. But the crowd joins in. There's ease in the room now, like a collective exhale. That one laugh says more than any treaty ever could. Historians still debate whether these moments, so ephemeral, so soft, actually changed anything structurally. Trade agreements wouldn't come for years. Military stances remained tense. Taiwan still loomed in the background like a very large, very uninvited elephant. But ask anyone who was there and they'll tell you the atmosphere changed, not overnight, but irrevocably. One of your teammates strikes up a quiet friendship with a young Chinese interpreter who admits after some tea and careful glances that she's never spoken to an American before. She asks what New York smells like. You try to describe hot pretzels, car exhaust, and street cart coffee, and her eyes light up like you're describing the moon. The quirky bit. One night during this visit, you get a ping-pong rematch with Zhuang Zedong himself. It's in a private gym, no press, no spectators, just a friendly volley. Zhuang is older now, a little slower, but still graceful. You exchange a few rallies, joke about your backhands, and finally, after a tight rally, he says in halting English, "Small ball, big world." You smile. That line will live in your brain rent-free for years. Meanwhile, in Washington, Nixon is reviewing his briefing packets for a visit that is now more than rumor. The trip is being choreographed down to the second flight paths, handshake angles, menu selections. There's debate about whether the president should bow. Should he toast Mao? Should he mention Taiwan? Kissinger suggests staying vague on all fronts. Classic Kissinger. You drift through this moment in history like a tired diplomat in soft sneakers. Even the air feels symbolic. In Tiananmen Square, crowds shuffle past the flags, unsure whether to wave, stare, or pretend they aren't watching you watch them. It's a city holding its breath, caught between what was and what might be. And then comes another moment of pure human absurdity. An American player, bored during a long motorcade ride, pulls out a paddle and starts bouncing a ball against the tinted window of the car. A few Chinese soldiers at a checkpoint laugh. One even gives him a thumbs up. The motorcade doesn't stop. The Cold War doesn't end, but that ping-pong ball, it bounces clean and rhythmic in a place where American echoes hadn't reached in a generation. Back home, Americans still argue over what's happening. Some pundits call it capitulation, others hail it as genius. But for those involved, the politics barely register. What you remember is the smell of dumplings in a crowded mess hall, the way your interpreter helped you find the word for spin in Mandarin, and the look on a local boy's face when you handed him a spare paddle and told him to keep it. Later, that paddle would hang in a museum. You didn't expect that either. Now you find yourself standing at the edge of something even stranger, a cultural tightrope stretched taut between two superpowers that barely know how to look each other in the eye, let alone shake hands, without a translator and a team of security agents pacing nervously nearby. You're in a dining hall in Beijing, now seated across from Chinese officials, with practiced smiles and soft rehearsed phrases like friendship through sports and people-to-people ties. You nod politely, chew slowly, and silently pray you're not eating duck feet again. These dinners, known officially as banquets, are diplomatic theatre. But the props are edible, the lighting is dim, and the scripts are just vague enough to make everyone wonder if something real might slip through. A toast is made to mutual understanding. You clink your glass smile, your most non-threatening smile, and hope you don't accidentally trigger a minor international incident by using the wrong chopsticks. You've learned to speak in gestures, not just words. You give away your last souvenir pin to a teenage Chinese fan who timidly asks for an autograph. You take an extra 5 minutes posing for a photo with a local school teacher who has never met an American. And you really listen as your host, a retired Chinese sports official, quietly tells you he once saw Babe Ruth on a poster and thought the man was fictional. Like a cartoon, he chuckles. Historians still argue whether these seemingly trivial cultural moments, tea ceremonies, badminton lessons, chopstick fumbles, had any lasting effect on diplomacy, but that's because they tend to study treaties, not faces. You've seen those faces. You've seen the guard at the hotel smile when he thought no one was watching. You've seen the little girl at the stadium who waved her red scarf and giggled when you bowed back. And you know without doubt that something changed. Let's not forget the quirky one of your teammates becomes a minor folk hero in China after performing a clumsy but enthusiastic Tai Chi routine in a park. A crowd gathers. An old man claps. Someone offers him a steamed bun. It's not ping-pong diplomacy. It's steamed bun diplomacy. And somehow it works. Meanwhile, American journalists are catching on. The press coverage shifts from baffled curiosity to cautious optimism. Headlines now read Chinese charm offensive sportsman or statesman and the inevitable slightly forced ping and policy. You read them on a creased copy of Time magazine and realize that the American public is slowly warming to the idea that maybe, just maybe, China isn't a monolithic, unknowable force, but a country of people just like them who happen to like table tennis and hot tea. And then amid the dumplings and awkward toasts, you're ushered into a quieter moment. A visit to a school, not a fancy one, but a real one, with chipped paint and rows of serious students in blue uniforms. You're shown around by a young teacher with careful English and infinite patience. The children ask questions. What does America look like? Do you play basketball? What is hamburger? You do your best to answer, even drawing a hamburger on the chalkboard, which earns you a round of applause and at least 3 stifled giggles. When it's time to go, one of the students presents you with a folded paper crane. You accept it with a bow, realizing it's probably the most diplomatic object you'll carry home. And while you've been breaking bread or steamed buns, technically across tables in Beijing, other tables are being set for something bigger. In a secret meeting room thousands of miles away, Henry Kissinger is fine-tuning the itinerary for Nixon's historic trip. Every handshake, every meal, every pause between sentences will be choreographed like a ballet staged in a nuclear silo. You don't know it yet, but you're part of the dress rehearsal. Evening falls over Beijing and the city slips into its usual hush. You sit by the window in your hotel room looking out over tiled rooftops and neon signs, just beginning to hum. You hold the paper crane from the schoolgirl, and think about everything you've seen, the formal ceremonies, the unplanned laughter, the strange sense of familiarity in a place you once thought entirely foreign. Tomorrow you'll leave, but tonight you feel a rare quiet in your bones. Not exhaustion, though you are tired, but something else, a kind of peace. Like maybe, just maybe, a paddle and a ball really can carry the weight of a continent-spanning silence. And just before bed you write in your notebook, this isn't just diplomacy, it's something softer, quieter, more human, a new kind of dialogue spoken in rallies and smiles. You don't know who will read that note, but you know it'll matter. You're back on American soil now, and everything feels just a little off-kilter. The grass is greener, the roads wider, the voices louder, but you've brought something home with you, something you can't quite name. Not a souvenir, not a piece of paper, but a shift in how you see the world. You find yourself watching the evening news with a squint, listening more closely when they mention China when before you might have just changed the channel. The welcome you get is enthusiastic, if a bit confused. At the airport, there's a scattering of reporters, a few curious bystanders, even a welcome banner that reads, "Thanks ping-pongers," a term you quietly hope never catches on. Friends ask if you got brainwashed. Your neighbor says, "So, was it scary?" And someone else leans in and asks, "Did you eat a dog?" You sigh. There's a lot of catching up to do. And yet something's undeniably changed in how Americans view the distant behemoth once known only as Red China. You see it in op-eds, in college essays, in school debates. China has a face now, multiple faces even. Zhuang Zedong becomes something of a mythical figure in these stories, half athlete, half ambassador. His image appears in magazines. A sports show runs a profile on him. Somewhere someone tries to pitch a movie. Hollywood always 10 minutes behind history. The media blitz begins. You're interviewed by local newspapers, college radio stations, even one guy who runs a ping-pong podcast out of his garage. Yes, even in the 70s, someone tried. The narrative becomes smoother with every retelling. You shake your head, wondering if the game you love has somehow become a metaphor for geopolitics. But the real surprise comes a few weeks later when you're invited to the White House. You enter through gates that gleam in the morning sun and find yourself seated in a formal room that smells of waxed wood and filtered ambition. Nixon enters all brisk nods and carefully rationed smiles. He thanks the team for being good ambassadors of peace. He even attempts a ping-pong joke. It doesn't quite land, but everyone laughs anyway. Historians still debate whether this moment, the White House reception, was just political theater or something more. Was Nixon genuinely moved by what the team had done, or was he seizing a narrative that conveniently aligned with his own plans? Either way, the photo op goes viral in a pre-internet 3 days to make the paper sort of way. You shake the president's hand and think, man, this sport is weirdly powerful. Meanwhile, letters flood your mailbox. Some are from kids inspired to pick up a paddle. Others are from veterans who fought in Korea and never thought they'd live to see peace with the East. One, in shaky handwriting, reads, "I never liked communists, but if they play ping pong, maybe they're not so bad." The quirky part. You're invited to do exhibitions in middle schools across the country. You play in cafeterias where the ceiling tiles rattle and the floor smells like fish sticks. And still the kids cheer, not because you're famous, but because you played a game that helped open a door that had been shut their whole lives. One even gives you a hand-drawn card, a Chinese dragon holding a ping-pong paddle. You tuck it into your suitcase like it's a state medal. Back in China, your visit is still being talked about. In party meetings and youth clubs, the phrase friendship match becomes a fixture. The government even produces a limited-run poster showing a Chinese and American player shaking hands over a ping-pong table flanked by doves. You spot it months later in a tiny Chinatown bookstore in San Francisco. It's real. You didn't imagine any of it. But not everyone is happy. Some conservative voices in the US call the whole thing propaganda. They say the Chinese are just using sports to manipulate global opinion. And some hardline Chinese officials quietly express discomfort at how fast the walls are being cracked. The idea of Americans being humanized doesn't sit well with everyone, but the genie's out of the bottle, or maybe the ball's off the table. And here's where things begin to tangle Taiwan. The American ping pong team had long played friendly matches with Taiwan, which was still officially recognized by the US as China. Now, after this sudden warmth with Beijing, everything's upside down. Taiwan is hurt, confused, and suddenly sidelined. The American team is caught in a quiet crossfire. "Why do you play over there?" a Taiwanese official asks one of your teammates. "Because they invited us," he replies. It's not the answer anyone wants, but it's honest. That tension won't go away. In fact, it will grow into one of the great unresolved knots of modern geopolitics. But at this moment, this one small, awkward moment, you're just a former athlete with a suitcase full of postcards and a dozen rolled-up red banners you have no idea what to do with. One evening, you go to a local gym and play a quiet game of ping pong with your younger cousin. He asks, "What was it like, China?" You pause mid-serve and say, "It was different, but not as different as I thought." And as the ball bounces back and forth between you, you realize just how true that is. You blink and suddenly it's February 1972, your television hums softly in the corner of the room, and on the grainy black and white screen, the unimaginable unfolds Richard Nixon. The same Richard Nixon who once called communist China a menace to world peace is stepping off Air Force One onto the tarmac in Beijing. The sky is grey, the flags are fluttering. The moment is sharp, like the whole world just leaned in and held its breath. You sink deeper into the couch, half in awe, half in disbelief. Did you really help set this in motion? Did that sweaty gym in Nagoya and a stray shuttle bus lead here to the world's most powerful man, walking straight into the dragon's lair with a smile on his face and a carefully practiced handshake? You watch as Nixon is greeted by Premier Zhou Enlai, the same man who once called America an imperialist aggressor. But today, Zhou extends his hand, first surprising even the most jaded diplomats watching from home. And that right there is the money shot Nixon and Zhou hand in hand on Chinese soil. Historians still debate whether the gesture was purely symbolic or genuinely groundbreaking. Was China using Nixon to break out of isolation? Was Nixon using China to play a masterstroke against the Soviet Union? Both theories carry weight, but whatever the motives, the moment itself can't be faked. The handshake is real, the audience is global, and the meaning is enormous. You catch yourself leaning forward as the motorcade winds through the streets of Beijing. No cheering crowds, no confetti, just silent rows of curious onlookers peering out from behind bicycles and woolen coats. For many of them, this is the first time they've seen an American, let alone the President of the United States. And for Americans, this is their first real look behind the bamboo curtain, inside the Great Hall of the People. Nixon sits across from Mao Zedong in a meeting so momentous it almost doesn't feel real. Mao is frail now, his voice gravelly, but his presence remains immense. He welcomes Nixon with wry wit and surprising warmth. "You have come a long way," he says. Nixon nods, replying, "This was the week that changed the world." And you, sitting in your living room, snack-untouched mouth slightly open, know that he might actually be right. The quirky bit. During the state banquet, Nixon is served a dish he doesn't quite recognize. He leans to his interpreter and whispers, "What is this?" The reply comes, "It is fish, cooked in the style of Sichuan." Nixon blinks and murmurs, "Spicy peace offering, huh?" It doesn't make the newspapers, but the staff laughs about it for weeks. Meanwhile, back home, American viewers are captivated. Newspapers print photos of Nixon walking the Great Wall, gazing into the hazy distance like a Cold War philosopher. One cartoonist sketches him in a ping-pong uniform balancing on a net between two continents. It's absurd, yes, but somehow accurate. And all the while, behind the scenes, real negotiations are unfolding. Trade routes are discussed, cultural exchanges are drafted, scientific cooperation is floated. Even the idea of diplomatic liaison offices begins to take shape, baby steps toward full recognition. The highlight, Zhou Enlai hosts a small closed-door reception where the conversation turns to the original ping-pong players. They were the first ambassadors, Zhou says. Not official, but honest. Someone in the room raises a toast to the athletes. You get mentioned by name. You don't hear about it until months later, but when you do, it stops you cold. You mattered. You weren't just a side act, you were chapter 1. Later that night, you receive a call from an old teammate. "Are you watching this?" he asks, breathless. "We were there before all of them." You nod slowly, still staring at the screen where Nixon, awkward but determined, is raising his glass in toast to a room full of men who once called him the enemy. Yeah, you say, "We were." The funny thing is the actual ping-pong games, they've faded a bit. You can't even remember the score of your final match in Beijing, but you remember the sound of laughter after a mistranslated joke. You remember the warmth of a paper crane tucked into your coat pocket. You remember the weight of being a guest in a place that was once entirely closed to the world. And now, as Nixon's week in China plays out across front pages and living rooms, something else begins to ripple through American society. A curiosity, a shift. People start looking at maps, wondering what Beijing really looks like, what dumplings taste like, whether Chinese kids play with toys like theirs. It's not diplomacy in the traditional sense, it's quieter, more subtle, it's understanding pinged and ponged into being. And in one small California high school, a group of students set up a table in the gym and post a handwritten sign, "Peace Match USA versus China, all welcome." You drive by it just for fun, you don't go in, but you smile. You're back in your own bed now, home at last, but everything has a different texture. The ping of the microwave reminds you of the ping-pong halls in Beijing. A stack of mail on your table includes a letter from a Chinese student you met, sent through a tangled route of embassies and cousin networks. You open it carefully. The paper is thin, the ink faint, but the words are sincere. "You are the first American I have spoken to. Thank you for listening." You read it twice. Meanwhile, Nixon's visit continues to ripple through American life like a low-frequency tremor no one can quite ignore. Schools add China units to their world history curriculum. Libraries dust off old Mandarin textbooks. Ping-pong clubs suddenly see a bump in membership, and somewhere in Kansas a kid saves up to buy his first paddle because that's how peace started. But the buzz isn't all harmony. There are still cold winds behind the smiles. Both sides remain cautious, even suspicious. There's tension around the Taiwan issue. Vietnam still festers in the background. And Mao, while cordial during Nixon's visit, isn't about to loosen his grip on internal dissent. This is not a fairy tale, it's détente dressed in careful choreography. Still, something has broken loose from history's rigid script. You notice it in the small things. American magazines begin publishing Chinese recipes. A toy company releases a ping-pong set with red paddles labeled Friendship Edition. And somewhere in Shanghai, a child proudly tells her parents she wants to learn English so I can talk to the Americans. Historians still argue whether Nixon's trip was truly a breakthrough or simply a calculated pause in Cold War hostilities. Was China seeking recognition or just playing a long game of leverage? Was America embracing openness or merely hedging against the Soviets? These are the kinds of questions that PhDs love to squabble over. You just remember the sound of that little ball tapping rhythmically across the net while two nations forgot to hate each other for 5 quiet minutes. You get invited to speak at a university panel. The topic, sports and diplomacy more than a game. You sit beside a retired diplomat, a stern-looking professor, and a woman who once wrote speeches for Nixon. You're the wild card, the athlete with stories instead of theories. You recount the moment Zhuang Zedong handed Glenn Cowan the gift, the way that gift turned into a handshake, then an invitation, then a headline, then a history-shaping shift. You pause at the end and say, "I guess all it took was someone getting on the wrong bus." The audience laughs, but it's the thoughtful kind of laugh, the kind that lands like a question mark. Afterwards, a student approaches you, notebook in hand, eyes glowing. "Did it really feel like history was happening?" she asks. You nod slowly. It felt like history was stretching, not snapping, not changing all at once, just bending a little. The quirky part, you find out later that Zhuang Zedong, now semi-retired, gave a speech to a group of Chinese students where he said almost the same thing. History is not a wall, he said, it is a door. Sometimes a ball bounces it open. Across the ocean, that door remains open, just a crack, but open. The US and China begin limited trade talks. Journalists are allowed back into each other's countries. There are even whispers of a future student exchange program. Not bad for two nations that once couldn't agree on whether the other had the right to exist. You meet up with your old teammates every now and then. Some have moved on, others coach. One opened a ping pong bar that serves dumplings and craft beer. You joke that you should have trademarked Pong Diplomacy when you had the chance. But sometimes you just sit together in silence watching old footage of your matches on grainy VHS tapes. You laugh at your haircuts, you cringe at your footwork, and you remember with startling clarity what it felt like to stand at that green table under the bright lights, knowing the world was somehow watching. And every now and then you still get a letter. Thank you, a memory, a photo from someone who says, "Because of what you did, my father met his college roommate in Shanghai." Or, "My mom learned English so she could teach in Beijing." You keep them in a drawer, each one, a reminder that peace doesn't always arrive with fanfare or fireworks. Sometimes it just rallies softly back and forth. You think about that when you play now, less competitively, more meditatively. The rhythm of the game feels like breathing, predictable, reassuring, balanced. Just like the moment the world didn't blink and tried, however briefly, to meet across the net. You're in a bookstore now, years later, flipping through a glossy coffee table book titled Moments That Changed the World. You smile softly when you see it there, on page 117, nestled between the moon landing and the fall of the Berlin Wall, is a photo of Zhuang Zedong shaking hands with Glenn Cowan. The caption is short, Pong Diplomacy, 1971. A smile across the divide. No footnotes. No timeline. Just an image and a memory that still thuds gently in your chest. So much has changed since then. China is no longer the closed, mysterious monolith it once was. It's on the rise now, booming cities, skyscrapers, international students, smartphones, and you occasionally wonder if the people walking through modern Shanghai ever think about how it all began with a ping pong paddle. At a reunion event hosted by the US Table Tennis Association, you meet a new generation of players. They're sleek, fast technical machines in sneakers. They nod respectfully when introduced to you, but there's a flicker of surprise in their eyes when they realize you were one of the originals. The ones who went behind the curtain before it was cool. One of them asks, "Did it feel scary?" You pause. "Yes," you say. And also strangely peaceful. You look around the room and see banners that read 50 years of friendship. It still feels surreal. Once upon a time, the word friendship was weaponized in propaganda. Now it's printed on lanyards. And that's when it hits you, the term ping pong diplomacy has become a cliche. You hear it in corporate events, in sports news, even in sitcoms. It's shorthand now for any unlikely thaw between rivals. Some pundits roll their eyes when they hear it. Others wield it with too much earnestness. But you know what it really means. You were there. You saw the first bounce. Historians still debate what happened behind closed doors during those early visits, how much was image, how much was impact. But there's no denying that the invitation of a handful of American athletes to China was the beginning of something bigger than sport. It made conversation possible. It cracked the ice without shattering the lake. You remember one scene particularly vividly, Zhou Enlai and an American team official sitting side by side in a quiet room between events. No translators, no cameras, just them sipping tea, nodding slowly. They weren't discussing troop movements or ideology. They were talking about weather, how Beijing got so dry in the winter, how DC had too many mosquitoes. And in that strange, quiet exchange about nothing, there was everything. A shared humanity no one could script. The quirky part. Years later, you receive an invitation to visit China again, not as a player, but as a guest of honor. You go, and this time there are no handlers, no watchers, no carefully staged photos. You walk the streets of Beijing with a freedom you never imagined on that first visit. You drink coffee at a shop that plays American jazz. You buy a toy for your grandson in a department store where once you were only shown propaganda books. You even spot a street vendor playing a video of your 1971 match. You tap him on the shoulder and say, "That's me." He doesn't believe you. You laugh and walk on. At a small museum in Shanghai, there's a display dedicated to ping-pong diplomacy. It features your jersey, a scuffed paddle, and a photo of the original US team standing awkwardly beside Chinese officials in olive drab. The lighting is soft. There's a bench for visitors to sit and watch archival footage. You sit down too, not to watch yourself, but to see the audience, to see their faces as they look at a time when the world dared to soften. On the flight home, a flight attendant notices your pin, the little red and blue badge shaped like a ping-pong paddle. "Is that vintage?" she asks. "It's real," you say. "I played in China before we had embassies." She blinks. You wonder what diplomacy will look like in the future. Drones, holograms, AI translators that make every conversation smooth and soulless. You hope not. You hope there's still room for tea, shared between near strangers, for kids handing each other paper cranes, for a simple game played across languages and borders. Because at the end of the day, it wasn't the policies or the communiques that cracked open the silence. It was the presence. It was people sitting down across from each other and saying, without words, "I see you." And for one fleeting rally, that was enough. The years go by, but the memory never really leaves you. It's there in the background noise of your life, like the soft, rhythmic tap-tap of a ball across a net you can still hear, even when the room is quiet. You're older now, grayer, maybe a bit slower on your feet, but still holding on to the paddle like it's a part of you, which at this point it kind of is. Every so often a journalist or a documentary crew reaches out. They want to talk about the miracle of ping-pong diplomacy. They bring cameras, clipboards, and questions you've answered 100 times. You smile and oblige, trying to sound insightful, while wondering if the coffee they brought you is any good. They always ask the same thing. Did you know at the time what it would become? And every time you give the same honest answer, "No, we were just athletes." And then because it's true, you add, "But we knew it felt different." One day you're invited to speak at a high school. The gym smells like every gym you've ever played, in sweat, floor wax and pizza from lunch period. You tell the students the story from the beginning, about the bus in Nagoya, about Zhuang Zedong's gift, about Mao's invitation and Nixon's eventual handshake. You show them a picture of yourself much younger, in your old tracksuit hair, flopping over your eyes. They laugh. One asks, "Were you nervous?" You grin, terrified. Later, a girl raises her hand and asks, "Do you think anything like that could happen now, with another country?" You pause. Not because you don't have an answer, but because it's the right kind of question. Finally, you say, "Only if someone's willing to take the first friendly step, and someone else is willing to believe it." Historians still debate whether the full thaw in US-China relations was inevitable or a fluke, whether it was Nixon's timing, Mao's fading health, or Kissinger's back-channel finesse. But you know it was also something smaller. A bus, a smile, a painting handed from one young man to another with no idea what would follow. And here's the quirky part at a reunion dinner for retired players. Years later, someone brings out a cake shaped like a ping-pong table. Tiny paddles made of marzipan. The whole thing leans dangerously to one side, and someone mutters, "Like our politics." The room explodes in laughter. For a few minutes, it's just you and the old gang, remembering a time when you were more than athletes. You were unintentionally envoys. After the meal, one of your teammates pulls you aside. He's holding a yellowed envelope. Inside is a letter from a Chinese player, one you hadn't seen since '71. It's written in careful, looping characters with a translation tucked behind. "Do you remember when we played and there was a fire alarm during the match? I think we both pretended not to hear it. I think that moment more than anything is how I knew you were a friend." You fold it gently, put it in your coat pocket. There's no rush to read it again. It'll be there. You find yourself one afternoon walking past a local rec center where a group of kids is playing ping pong on a cracked table under a tree. You stop, watch. One of them notices you and calls out, "Wanna play?" You hesitate, then nod. "Why not?" You step up, paddle in hand, and the game begins. They don't know who you are, they don't know the history, and that's okay. You're not there for that. As the ball pings and pongs across the dusty net, you smile, not because you're winning, you're definitely not, but because the rhythm is still there. The simplicity, the connection, the game that once carried the weight of nations is now just a game again. But that in itself is a quiet kind of victory. You think about everything that's happened since 1971, the shifts, the setbacks, the progress, the tension. It hasn't been easy. The road wasn't smooth, but the bridge was built, and you helped lay the first plank. As the sun begins to dip, you hand your paddle back to the kid and say, "You've got a good backhand." He grins and replies, "Thanks, my grandpa taught me. Said he used to play all the time." You raise an eyebrow. "What was his name?" The kid shrugs. "Don't know, but he said he played with Americans once." You nod. Walk away slowly. That's enough. Somewhere between that serve and that story, you realize the ball never really stopped bouncing. You sit by your window one quiet evening, the light fading gently over the rooftops, sipping tea from a chipped porcelain cup you bought during that first trip to China. It's got a little crack down the side now, but somehow that makes it feel more authentic, more lived in, kind of like the relationship it once symbolized. You glance at the bookshelf and there it is again, your old paddle framed in a shadow box. Next to it, a photo of you mid-swing, awkward and determined, standing across the table from a Chinese champion whose name is now etched permanently in the annals of history, or at least in footnotes, and a few well-researched documentaries. Over the years, you've grown used to being called a witness to history. It sounds dramatic. And yet what you actually remember most clearly isn't the grand speeches or the policy shifts, it's the small things. The warmth of a shared thermos of tea on a bus ride, the unexpected laughter in a gym where no one shared a common language, the solemn nod from a student guide who was too nervous to speak, but whose eyes said, "I hope you see me." Historians still argue over whether the ping-pong moment was truly spontaneous, or if it was engineered from the start, nudged along by savvy leaders with one eye on their people and the other on the press. Some claim Zhuang Zedong had orders, others say he acted on instinct. Maybe it was both. But from where you were standing, it felt like something real, something human, the quirky detail. At one point, after years of growing diplomatic engagement, the Chinese government issued a special commemorative ping-pong ball, gold lettering, little red stars packed in a silk-lined box. You received one in the mail unannounced, no note, no ceremony, just the ball, as if to say we haven't forgotten either. And now as China and the US navigate a new, more complicated era, marked by trade tensions, digital wars, climate negotiations, and mutual suspicion, you sometimes wonder, could there ever be another ping-pong moment? Could someone somewhere do something that simple again and make it matter? You're not naive. You know the world is louder now, more connected, more divided, more anxious, but also more aware, more capable of recognizing symbolism when it shows up in unexpected forms. So maybe it won't be ping-pong next time. Maybe it'll be esports or climate activism or a shared mission to Mars. But you you trust that somewhere out there, another kid will get on the wrong bus and sit down beside someone they've been told to fear. And maybe if the universe is kind, one of them will have the courage to say hello. A few months ago, you received an invitation to attend a joint US-China anniversary event in Beijing. You couldn't go doctor's orders, knees acting up, but you sent a note, a short one. "Thank you for remembering. May the game never end." They read it aloud at the banquet. Someone told you there were tears. And so the story continues, not in headlines or headlines memory, but in quiet, persistent echoes. In classrooms where teachers now say, "People's Republic of China," without needing to clarify. In museum exhibits titled, "Sport as Diplomacy." In books with your name in the index, somewhere between Cold War, soft power, and unofficial diplomacy. Sometimes you think of that moment when you first stepped off the plane in Beijing, heart-pounding, stomach unsettled, paddle in hand. The weight of a nation on your shoulders, and you didn't even pack enough socks. And you laugh, because if someone had told you then what it would lead to, you would have said, "You've got the wrong guy." But history knew, and you showed up. That's all it really asked. The final years of your journey through this strange chapter of history feel softer, gentler, as though time itself understands that what once carried tension now only needs reflection. You find yourself being asked less about policy and more about feeling, less about Mao or Nixon and more about what it meant to be there, to see walls lower not with a bang, but with a bounce. You write a short piece for a magazine, nothing too flashy, just your memories, your thoughts. The title they give it is simple across the table. In it, you describe the hollow quiet of a Beijing hotel room in 1971, the taste of the first tea. You were too nervous to enjoy the slow turn of a young interpreter's head when you said, "You speak very well." The article is shared far more than you expect. Teachers reach out, so do players. One says, "Your story made me pick up a paddle again." And in that something clicks. Your story isn't history for sleep, it's history for hope. A reminder that people can choose to face each other. That even when governments glare and glare, the people on the ground still get to smile, to extend a hand, to choose the quieter kind of courage. You're invited one last time to a commemorative match. It's not in Beijing, not in DC. It's held in a neutral city, quietly symbolic, Geneva. Two young players walk to the table, one from the US, one from China. The crowd is polite. Camera shutters click softly. You sit in the front row, wrapped in a scarf someone gave you back in '72. The rally begins. A gentle serve, a steady return. The pace increases, then slows again. No one speaks, they just watch the ball move left, right, like a pendulum trying to find balance. You feel your chest rise. A few seats away, someone is crying. You understand why. And in that moment you realize it was never about diplomacy with a capital D. It was about dignity, about choosing connection in a world designed to divide. Chuang Zedong passed away a few years ago. You couldn't attend the memorial, but you sent a letter. It was read aloud by a former teammate. You wrote, "He handed me a gift, and the world changed. I hope I thanked him enough." Sometimes at night you still dream of that first match, the scuffed green table, the waxy floor, the smell of dust and chalk and nerves. You see the ball lift gently into the air, spin and land squarely in play. A clean shot, no tricks, just intention. You don't remember if you won, you're almost certain you didn't, but it never mattered. You played, you were seen, you saw. And now in this quiet final moment of your telling you, close your eyes and smile. You were never meant to write the headlines, just to live the paragraph no one thought would exist. And you did. And so here you are, blanketed in the quiet warmth of a story that drifted from ping-pong tables to the meeting rooms of global power, from a misty gym in Japan to banquet halls in Beijing. The ball has long stopped bouncing, the crowds long faded, the flashbulbs dimmed, but the echo lingers soft and low like a lullaby told in plastic and rubber and trust. Let it wash over you now, the memory of hesitant footsteps across borders of tea poured by careful hands, of a handshake offered not out of duty but possibility. Let your breathing slow as you imagine the dust motes drifting in the air of a room where two players, once strangers, rallied gently back and forth, watched by a world that didn't yet know it could hope. The lights are low now, the silence thick. History no longer demands your attention, it just asks for your rest. You've walked through a story of change that wasn't forged by weapons or walls, but by rhythm, by repetition, by choosing to stay in the game. So close your eyes, knowing that sometimes peace arrives without applause, that sometimes the world moves not through thunder, but through a whisper and a swing. Tonight, may your dreams rally gently back and forth, soft and steady, like that first ball sailing over the net, not with power, but with purpose.